Sometimes when we're lost, it helps to stop and seek direction. When I first started in ministry, I thought I basically knew what I was supposed to do. I figured that so long as I prayed enough, stayed connected with God, and used the gifts that God had given me, I would basically be okay. I think I was right. I just didn't realize how hard it would be. You have to remember, a lot was going on at the time: political turmoil, unwinnable wars in the Middle East, and serious struggles about who was to be included and who was not. We've come a long way. And at first, I tried my best to stay out of the political fray. I figured you catch more flies with honey or something like that. In other words, I just tried to keep my head down, just do what I was supposed to do, just put my foot in front of the other one and go. But then things changed. The world changed. I realized that I could no longer stay silent. Not if I wanted to honor the call that God had placed on my life. And I did. I do. Maybe you've been there. In that moment when you realize that you've stayed silent for too long. When you realize that if you don't say something soon, you're going to be complicit in whatever is happening out there. When you have to say something. I kept telling myself, Eli, I went by Eli then, I kept telling myself, just stick to your own thing. Stay in your own lane, don't worry about what's going on out there, but try as I might, I couldn't. Things had always been rough, but they just seemed to get worse. And with each successive leader, they became worse and worse and worse. I never thought we would have someone as bad as Omri. It's hard to remember him now, I know, given all that came after, but by almost every account, he was worse than any who had come before him. And then, of course, came his son. As with every leader, he wanted to assert his power early, so Ahab made some new rules. I think it had to do with his new wife, Jezebel. She was a Phoenician princess. He started to worship her god, which wouldn't have been so bad if it was just him, but he insisted that we worship that new god as well. He wanted us to abandon the God of Israel, the God of Jacob, the one who had been with us when we were slaves in Egypt, who had been with us while we found our way through the wilderness, the one who had given the law to Moses on Mount Horeb. He wanted us to leave God behind. Are you picking up what I'm lying down? Smelling what I'm stepping in? As if it were that easy. That's when I knew I could no longer stay silent. Sure, it'd been a lot easier if I did. Some people chose that route, some of my other prophet friends. It's amazing what people of faith will put up with in their leaders. But for better or worse, that's just not who I am. Which was how I found myself standing before the king of Israel. Me, Elijah the Tishbite, a prophet of Israel. Who would have thought that a little boy from Gilead would stand before a king? It just goes to show. People always ask, and the truth is I had no idea what I was going to say when I went in there. I had like zero plan. I just knew I needed to say something, and so I got my audience with the king, and as he was standing there before me, I just opened my mouth and trusted that the words would be there, and I said it. I said that there will be neither dew nor rain unless by my word. I threatened a drought. Yeah, I know, it's a little dramatic. Hindsight being what it was. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and we, my friends, were desperate. I spit out the words, not really fully understanding what I was saying, and the king just kind of stared back at me. He didn't really say anything, though I noticed his face was growing a little red, and so I took that as my cue to excuse myself and to head out the door. I'm bold, not dumb, and so I left. The next 2 years were full. As the ground began to dry up and people became more frustrated, they began to talk about that threat that I made to the king. They began to point to the God of Israel, and things were working out. People were coming to the faith. They were remembering what this was all about. They kept coming along. We even had prophets that would rise up. I would train them, and then they'd go out and share the good news as well. I was, by almost every measure, a success. But sometimes, when you're so busy doing the thing that God calls you to do, it's easy to forget why you're doing it to begin with. I think I was so busy connecting people with God that I forgot to connect with God myself. Strange how sometimes your highest moment is followed so closely by your lowest. Ahab and Jezebel grew tired of my machinations and ordered all of the prophets of Israel killed, except for me. All of my friends, my colleagues, the people that I had trained, gone in a moment. And at that point, I forgot everything that I had learned. I lost it. I grew so angry. I came up with this convoluted test to show that my God was better than their God, and when my God won, I slaughtered all of their prophets. Every last one of them. And then I looked down and I didn't recognize myself. In one day, I broke 2 of the most important commandments. Do not put the Lord your God to the test, and love your neighbor. Do not kill. We're really only called to do 2 things: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And on that day, I broke both of them. And so I ran. People think that I left because I was afraid of Jezebel's threat, and maybe on some level I was, but the truth is I was more frightened of myself, of who I'd become. I went as far as Beersheba, and then I took a route by myself through the wilderness. I wandered out through the wilderness and just kept going. I kept walking. The whole time thinking about where I had gone wrong, about the failure that had happened, about the blood that is on my hands that I just couldn't seem to wash away. I didn't know where I wanted to be. or even if I wanted to be. I finally just sat down under a broom tree and cried. I prayed maybe for the first time in years. Said to God, it's enough. Now, O Lord, take me away. Take my life away. I'm no better than my ancestors. And then I laid down and went to sleep, praying that I would never. Maybe you've been there. In that moment when everything you thought you knew so well in life comes crashing down around you, your relationships, your career, your life is crashing down around you and you don't know what to do. Take it from me, you're not alone. So long as there's been people, there's been pain. So long as there's been love, there's been brokenness. But the good news is that so long as there's been brokenness, there's also been grace. That promise that there's nothing you could do or say to lose the love of God. God doesn't take away the pain that we have. That's not what God does. Instead, God stands with us in the middle of that pain, in the middle of our loss, in the middle of our brokenness, and reminds us that we're not in this alone. I don't know what it was that woke me up from my slumber. Somehow I jostled awake and I looked, and there in front of me on a rock was a cake and a jar of water. Maybe it was there when I went to sleep, but I don't remember it, and I don't think so. I didn't even want to eat it. I know what you're thinking, who turns down free cake? But I was in such a state that even the sweet things in life seemed sour. I ate it anyway. Sometimes you just have to. And then I went to sleep again. This time I woke up again jostled, and there was food right in front of me, only this time I heard this voice inside of me that said, eat that food and go. You're going to need it for the journey ahead, or else you're going to find yourself lost. And so I didn't want to, but I got up, I ate the food, and I started one foot in front of the other. I started to find my way again for 40 days and for 40 nights, the longest in my life. I wandered. As those who have been through it can tell you, I didn't know what my destination was. I trusted that it would take care of itself. Which was how I found my way to Mount Horeb. You might recognize it as Mount Sinai, that place where Moses had received the law, but more importantly, where Moses had communed with God. And I stood in that same cave that Moses had stood, and I prayed to God. I just let it all out. Finally, I got it all off my chest, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I admitted everything that I had done. And suddenly I had this feeling that God was about to pass by. So I went and I stood in the cave and I looked out, and a storm came blowing in. And the wind cracked the rocks against the mountain, and the mountainside even broke apart. But God was not in the wind. And after the wind came an earthquake. And the ground shook. The earth quaked. But God was not in the quake. Then came a fire, so hot I could feel the heat from where I was. But God was not in the fire. And then came the sound of sheer silence. And I finally got it. See, God had been there the whole time. Through the winds and the quakes and the fires of life, God had been there the whole time. I just couldn't always feel or hear or see God, but that doesn't mean God was there. My whole life, I thought God had caused those calamities, that God was doing these things to me, but that's just not true. That's not the way life works. God doesn't cause those things that go wrong in our lives. In some ways, God's heart is the first to break. No, God doesn't cause the fires or the storms. God stands with us in the middle of them, surrounds us with grace, and reminds us that we're not in this alone. And as we know, we can do a lot if we know we don't have to face it alone. Turns out I was right at the beginning of my ministry. We just have to stay connected with God. To be clear, I haven't been perfect since. I mean, look at all those times people have set a place for me and I didn't bother showing up. But what I learned on that day is that I don't have to be perfect to be loved. And the good news, friends, is that you don't either. I don't know what's going on in your life right now. How could I? But I do know this, that even if you are being tumbled by the wind, shaken by the quakes, or burnt by the fire, that whether you're at a high or a low moment in your life, wherever you are, God is. Sometimes